Alright, next we're going to be looking at the protection for the brain. So there's bone, there's connective tissue covering called the meninges, and there's cerebrospinal fluid. And there's also going to be a blood-brain barrier. So let's look at a little bit more detail for those. We have bone, that's the skull, meninges, which include the dura, arachnoid, and pia mater. Cerebrospinal fluid, which is also known as CSF, is going to cushion the brain. It's a delivery mechanism for nutrients and chemical signals. And the blood-brain barrier helps maintain a stable environment. Now let's look more at the meninges first. These are three connective tissue membranes that lie external to the central nervous system, so they cover both the brain and spinal cord. Listed superficial to deep, they are the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. And they function to protect and cover the central nervous system, cover blood vessels, and enclose venous sinuses. They form partitions within the skull and contain CSF or cerebrospinal fluid. So here we can see those meninges. We have the outer dura mater, which has a periosteal layer that is adjacent to bone, and a meningeal layer that is adjacent to the rest of the meninges. We have a middle arachnoid mater, and we have a deep pia mater that covers the ridges and valleys of the cerebrum. Now the dura mater is definitely the thickest, and it's very strong when it comes to the other connective tissue meningeal layers. So it's actually composed of those two fibrous connective tissue layers we saw, and those layers separate in certain areas to form sinuses called dural sinuses. So here we can see some of those sinuses, like the falx cerebri that fold and dips into the longitudinal fissure, and the fold that dips into the transverse fissure, the tentorium cerebelli. These areas called sinuses of the dura mater, they collect both deoxygenated blood from the brain and cerebrospinal fluid. Next, we're going to look at the middle arachnoid mater. This is the middle meningeal layer, and it forms a really loose kind of brain and spinal cord covering. Separated from the dura mater by the subdural space, a space under it, and beneath the arachnoid is going to be kind of another space. So we have a subdural space and a subarachnoid space. Both of these areas are filled with cerebrospinal fluid or CSF, and under the arachnoid mater, or in that subarachnoid space, we also have large blood vessels. There's also arachnoid villi that protrude superiorly into dural sinuses, and that permits cerebrospinal fluid to be absorbed into venous blood. And then we have our pia mater, the deepest meningeal layer that is very delicate and fragile and clings tightly to the brain and spinal cord. All right, we've already talked about the CSF or cerebrospinal fluid quite a few times. You find it around the brain, in the ventricles, and these areas that you find cerebrospinal fluid in the brain, the ventricles, oftentimes are outlined by ependymal glial cells. But have we really talked about the actual fluid? Well, it's mostly water, but it is similar in composition to blood, but it does contain less protein, different ion concentrations than blood plasma, and it acts really much like a cushion. It gives buoyancy to the brain, it's allowed to kind of float in its cavity, and it prevents the brain from crushing under its own weight. So it's very much a protective structure. It also nourishes the brain and carries chemical signals throughout it, so it is multifaceted. Separating parts of the brain from the blood is the blood-brain barrier, a protective mechanism that helps maintain a stable environment for the brain. Why would we want this barrier? Well, because some of the extracellular ions and things that we find in the body would act as neurotransmitters in the brain. So if the extracellular and intracellular environments of the brain and spinal tissue were in constant flux, neurons would fire uncontrollably. There's really no other body tissue that's so absolutely dependent on a constant internal environment as the brain. So things like amino acids, hormones, ions that naturally exist in the body and can exist in the brain can act as neurotransmitters. So we just don't want them there if they're not carefully being regulated and controlled, hence the blood-brain barrier. Now, what makes up the blood-brain barrier is capillary walls. That's a continuous kind of endothelium of these blood vessel walls. A kind of glue that sticks the other two layers together, which is a thick basal lamina, and a glial cell, which is the astrocyte. So we've talked about the astrocyte as something that does it all, really, for the brain, and it also makes up the blood-brain barrier. Next, we're going to be looking at a couple of traumatic head injuries and some other homeostatic imbalances before we talk about the spinal cord. So first, a concussion. This is a slight trauma, no permanent neurological damage. A contusion is more of a bruising of the brain, and if it's severe and near the brainstem, it can cause coma. A subdural or subarachnoid hemorrhage is a bleed in those spaces under those meningeal layers, and individuals are usually initially lucid when they have an hemorrhage in these areas, but they can deteriorate neurologically and quickly. Then cerebral edema, swelling of the brain, it actually can cause death if this pressure from the swelling of the brain is pushing on the brainstem, because it will damage and impair those cardiovascular centers and respiratory centers. There's also cerebrovascular accidents, which are more commonly called strokes, and these are caused when blood circulation to the brain is blocked and brain tissue dies. It is most commonly caused by a blockage of a cerebral artery, but other causes include compression of the brain, by a hemorrhage or edema, or even atherosclerosis. A TIA, or transient ischemic attack, is actually considered a temporary episode of reversible cerebral ischemia, and tissue plasminogen activator, or TPA, is the only approved treatment for a stroke that's caused by a cerebral artery blockage. This would increase the victim's chance of bleeding from 1% to 6%, so TPA is only administered if we know for sure that it's a coronary blockage, or we think based on symptoms it's a cerebral artery blockage. Other homeostatic imbalances include degenerative brain disorders. So you have Alzheimer's disease. This is a progressive degenerative disease of the brain that results in dementia. Parkinson's disease, a degeneration of the dopamine-releasing neurons of one of the basal nuclei, the substantia nigra. And Huntington's disease, which is a fatal hereditary disorder caused by the accumulation of the protein called huntingtin, and that leads to the degeneration of the basal nuclei that help with certain types of motor movement. There's also cerebral palsy, which is a lack of oxygen to developing fetus, which may cause voluntary muscles being poorly controlled or paralyzed. It also has some other symptoms. And multiple sclerosis, we've talked about before, is a demyelinating disorder of the central nervous system that also disrupts motor outputs. Alright, next we're going to be looking at the spinal cord, so make sure to come back for that last video.